Welcome to a little bit of London that is forever Jaipur.
Dear friends and lovers of literature, here we are again with JLF at the British Library 2021.
It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to the British Library, which has been my office in London for many years, and where my books have all been written and researched. And it's very nice to see this end of my life sort of double back on it.
Our amazing writers, today more than any time, because of the way the digital age has taken over, we need you to be able to make sense of the past, divine the future, and perhaps set in context what we're going through at this very point of time.
Do you feel that Britain and India can best intersect culturally?
Well, we've been intersecting for a long time. It's not that we will have to intersect. If you look at our cultural and historical relations, we go back a long way.
That may be nations or cultures or religions or sexualities, class, culture, gender, race, all those things, but that distance is somehow reduced or bridged because we're connecting at a very basic human level.
I believe in the ability to convey meaning by the written word is our superpower.
We welcome you back to another exciting session of the 2021 edition of JLF London at the British Library Virtual Festival. Our next session is Namita Gokhale, Jaipur and Beyond. Namita Gokhale in conversation with Sanjoy Roy. Writer, publisher and festival director Namita Gokhale speaks of a life in books. In a freewheeling conversation with Sanjoy Roy, she takes us on a journey from her 1984 debut novel Paro, Dreams of Passion, to the Himalayan trilogy, to Jaipur Journals and the Blind Matriarch, which is her 20th book. Namita's work covers multiple genres, including fiction, mythology, drama, Himalayan studies, and books for young readers. Namita Gokhale is an award-winning Indian writer. She has authored 20 books, including 11 works of fiction. Her first book, Paro, remains a cult classic. Her novel, Jaipur Journals, was published recently, as was Betrayed by Hope, a play on the poet Michael Madhusudan Dutt. Namita is a co-founder and co-director of the Jaipur Literature Festival. Sanjoy Roy, an entrepreneur of the arts, is the managing director of Teamwork Arts, which produces over 33 highly acclaimed performing arts, visual arts, and literary festivals in 40 cities across the world, including the iconic Jaipur Literature Festival, international editions of JLF, and the launch during lockdown digital JLF Brave New World series and JLF First Edition. You can access all our sessions at london.jlflitfest.org. You can also view them on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. We would love to know your views on the session. Please feel free to drop in your comments in the comment section. Help JLF London bring more quality content to you in these uncertain times and strengthen the community by donating to the link provided. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present Namita Gokhale, Jaipur and Beyond. Namita Gokhale in conversation with Sanjoy Roy.
Thank you all, and for all our audiences watching JLF London at the British Library, welcome. I'm absolutely delighted to have with us Namita Gokhale, a writer, publisher, and of course, Jaipur Literature Festival's festival director. And Namita has just released her new book. In fact, it should be out in the stands even as we speak. It's got this absolutely brilliant cover, though I'm showing it to you in reverse, and it's called The Blind Matriarch. Namita, congratulations on the book. I just read it in 2 sittings. I loved every aspect of it. So straight off to ask you, all your books, Paro, God's Graves, Grandmothers, Things to Leave Behind, The Blind Matriarch, they've all had strong women at the center of the story. And not just women who are strong, who have been empathetic, and most importantly, who have represented perhaps a way of life, the matriarchal way of life, which is also India's way of life. I know most people talk about it as a patriarchy. Very few people outside of India understand how the woman in the household, in a joint family, or a family that lives together as yours does at different floors, is really at the center of all activities. Tell us what this influence has been. Has it been your mother? Is it you? How is this sort of thread cut across all your books?
Sanjoy, I am not at all sure if this is a conscious decision to write like this. But every time I write a book, the strong woman emerges not as an emblem or a symbol, but she's just there because all my life I have been surrounded by strong women. I think the reason for that is twofold. One is that I grew up in the mountains, and in the Kumaon Hills, which was my home, is my home, I'd like to say, the women are ridiculously strong. I mean, they're physically, mentally, and emotionally strong. They go into the forest to gather fodder, firewood, and when they do that, if it is not at all uncommon if they encounter a panther or a tiger, that they will run after the poor beast with their scythe and, well, rescue a savage sister. They are physically very, very fit and tough, which is tragic because they have to be so tough because they have to walk miles to get water. It's a tough way of life. But it translates into their everyday attitudes. And the second part of it is that Indian religion is the only religion which still has a complete pantheon of women goddesses. For every male god, there is a female god who is not a consort, but who is a goddess in her own right. And a goddess in India is of one of two manifestations. A goddess can be Shant, which means the calm, benevolent, beneficial aspect of that feminine strength. And the other aspect is Ugra, or fierce. Those are the ones with their tongues hanging out and bloodied fingers and a skull around their neck. And both can be aspects of the same goddess. So the Ugra aspect of the goddess is something that has always appealed to me. The goddess Kali, the goddess Durga. The calm ones are good, but I personally feel inspired by the angrier manifestations of the goddess. And so all these women turn up in my novels, different historical periods, and some men too. And the men are perfectly nice, but sometimes a bit inadequate in the face of these women that turn up in my novels and my books.
What in fact is interesting, what you said, women in the hills go out to do the work. By and large, in Indian mythology and religion, the men have conjured up the woman. So Ma Durga was conjured up by Vishnu and Brahma when the gods went to them to say the earth is being destructed. It's a woman who was conjured up, not a man.
Well, I think that's because women have always been associated with magical powers because they have the magical power to procreate. And the lines between men and women in the old system of gods and goddesses was never that rigid. Shiva is always a part of Parvati. It's a gender neutral and a gender negative and positive manifestation. Shiva is both feminine and masculine. And his consort Parvati also has the strength of her husband Shiva. And I think all of us are androgynous. I mean, I think each of us has a man and a woman inside us. And at different times, it's the man who comes to the fore, and at different times, the feminine that comes to the fore. And and increasingly social mores today do understand and dictate that there are these many registers of gender identity. So of course the men caught up. The men had the intelligence to realize that she would have the madness to protect her own, not just in the way of a warrior, but with every guile and subterfuge and charm and deception at her available to her. I love to read myth for this reason, for the strategies and the cunning and the joy and the belief in life that they represent.
You know, you're talking about reading myth. The other thing that sort of goes through all your books is the unwritten part of it, where there is always this other presence, and I call it a presence. Sometimes you've articulated the presence, and I'm not just talking about spirits and ghosts and the bhoot pret that you and I often talk about, but there is a presence that underlines most of your books, and it's not written in, but you know it's there.
Yes, there is a very large unwritten book behind every book, because some of the ideas in that unwritten part are a bit too inarticulated to be really put it down. And yet at the same time, there are so many people who do recognize them. I will give you an example, you know. My new book, The Blind Matriarch, I'll jump straight to The Blind Matriarch, though you may have thought you'll come to her at the end of the conversation. But The Blind Matriarch as a novel has 3 levels of myth in it. The Blind Matriarch herself, though here she is a middle-class woman who lives in New Delhi on the top floor of an old house, is also Matangi Ma. And Matangi Ma is one of the 10 Mahavidyas, the Dash Mahavidyas, and the one I am particularly curious about. Matangi Ma is the tantric aspect of Saraswati. And there's a lot happening there, but her what do you say, the bird is her particular spirit figure, and it's a green parrot, which is the figure that hovers around her always, which is why this Babette inadvertently made it into the novel. And I didn't plan any of this. I just called her Matangi, and then I explored the role of Matangi. And then there is the Blind Matriarch herself, evokes for most Indians who have watched television ever in their life, and which is most Indians, is the figure of Gandhari, the blind queen of the Mahabharata. And their blindness is examined metaphorically as a way of seeing and not seeing. So these layers creep in. And thank you for recognizing that.
In fact, in The Blind Matriarch, you know, one of the allegories that you've looked at is the fact that you've left it to the audience to decide whether she chose not to see or she chose not to be aware because of what had happened with her and her partner, her husband, who used to beat up on her. And she made that choice pretty much like Gandhari did.
Absolutely.
Once again, myth sort of goes through all your books, and yet Ghatotkacha was actually an exploration of myth, but that still runs through every one of your books. Godgraves, Things to Leave Behind, even Jaipur Diaries. Tell us about your fascination again with myth, and in that telling, tell us your relationship with spirits, ghosts, and things that go bump at night.
So, yeah, my relationship with myth is that, first of all, I'm no scholar, and my knowledge is extremely patchy and unable to bear scrutiny. In fact, as we speak, I'm nervous about a session I have tomorrow with the Vasant Valley School, where they've been studying my Puff and Mahabharat for the last 11 years. And every year, it's a bit of a terror for me to face these students because they know a billion times more than I do. So I just leave it to questions and say, you tell me the answers and things like that, because the knowledge of myth in everybody in India across so many levels of society is just inborn. It's acquired. It's never learned. It just seeps in. Somebody said that I have a magpie mind, and indeed I do. So, there are odds and ends of information floating around my head, and you never know which of these will surface. But usually some mythic reference does surface. And the reason is that Indian myth, particularly because it's uninterrupted and constantly retold and constantly reinterpreted for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Nobody knows how many thousands and how many hundreds of thousands of years. But Indian myth is constantly reinterpreting itself. And it is a poetic examination and a poetic presentation of some very deep truths. That is why so many physics professors use Indian myth as a metaphor to explain what they find difficult to explain in equations to lay audiences. I mean, the dance of Shiva, the Tandav, all these things go into the minds of some of our great physicists, be it Carlo Rovelli or so many others. So the myth is just, some people have a mythic mind, I guess, and especially in my new novel, The Blind Matriarch, have tried to present a middle-class family in a mythic situation, which is not of any particular myth or sets of myths, but about the texture of how India thinks, and why the politics of India can never ever be understood unless you understand the mythic bent of mind here.
Namita, veering away from literature for a second, isn't it true that because we have such a strong, as you said, mythical tradition, or a tradition of myths that spin through every village, every town, every semi-rural or semi-urban space, irrespective of whether you're rich or poor or middle class, isn't this continued fascination and being steeped in the myth of that time or of that village, isn't that something that will outlive what we are seeing today, a sense of division?
I think that sense of division, I'm trying to understand it, and I don't know how deep it really is, because there are always things that assert and reassert themselves and fight it out. We are an argumentative nation, and some other people have picked up the argument, as they have every right to, and everybody will slug it out in the end, and each side will appropriate and take in some from the other, is what I feel. I also feel that the line between religion and myth is very interesting, because myth resides more in folklore, and it leads to the understanding of so many ethical situations, of so many strategic situations, while religion is also resides in ritual and the pure, very uninterrupted transmission of these rituals over the years. And sometimes, of course, ritual also goes into myth and all these things, but they are two strands, and we shouldn't get them too confused as well. And folklore is the third strand here, which sometimes myths are born before our eyes. When we were younger, there was a goddess, we meaning you, and you are much younger than me anyway. But when I was in school, there was something called Santoshi Ma, who suddenly appeared became the premium goddess of India. And I don't know where the lady is now, when she will emerge again. So goddesses come for their moment of manifestation to explain to people so many, sometimes scientific truths also, or a lot of the things like Shitla Devi, the smallpox goddess. If you had to burn your old clothes and belongings, maybe that was a way of killing the infections, or I don't know. I'm not a student of those areas, but they have a purpose. And sometimes, even though they may have a purpose, they tend to obstruct pure scientific understanding, but not always. I mean, I know our international viewers will find it strange, but no Indian will find it strange that our great scientists of ISRO and of the space establishment, who do so fantastically well, often, if not usually, choose an appropriate astrological moment to launch their missiles. and you yourself break a coconut for every time we begin on a new enterprise. So these things are also symbols, and symbols and rituals give us strength. And at the core of it is a very deep philosophy, a very deep set of philosophical beliefs which underlie everything and which cannot really be distorted. They can be misunderstood, they can be misinterpreted, but there is always the core of it, which has survived, as I said, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Nobody knows quite how many. Your guess is as good as mine. But it's going on, not going anywhere.
Staying with the other, at least what I got from your book is you weaved in the architecture of this particular house. It's pretty much a reference to Hindu philosophy with no clear walls, with no, it's sort of the way you describe it is that it was all interwoven floor to floor without necessarily saying that this is one or this is the other. It's sort of that slippery slope of Hinduism where everything goes.
Well, not just of Hinduism, because there's a Muslim lady there who also has her own. I wouldn't call it a slippery slope at all. I would call it the porous boundaries of understanding and acceptance. And there's a character there called Surya, who sort of could be the sutradhar of that alternative story within the book, who talks about the many ideas that are always in conflict in India. And he's somebody who's pretty much been everything from a pacifist to a Gandhian to a leftist to a rightist to a radical to a vegetarian. And I know you know many people like that, and I know many people like that, and they've really tried all the intellectual positions. And he dies before he reaches any reconciliation between these. So for me, the blind matriarch in this novel and that house is really an allegory of the Indian joint family. And I think that Hinduism and India, Bharat, that is India, the Indian Republic also, is a sort of a joint family. Often, in fact, usually dysfunctional, but within the same time giving some solace to the weakest within it, also being unbelievably cruel, but holding together. And the idea of this I live in a joint family myself for the last 20 years. And since my husband passed away, I moved back into my mom's house. And as you know, I live with my mother and me. This is my brother and my sister-in-law and my beloved nephew, and my children grew up here. So I know the texture of a joint family, as so many of us do. And joint or extended. And I think the fissures and the fault lines within India could be compared to the fissures and fault lines within an extended joint family, which we thought had stopped existing, but which during the pandemic somehow reasserted itself in different manifestations. I don't know. Do you feel that in the pandemic somewhere the joint family reinvented itself?
I think it did. I think it did in many ways. And for many people, it became a source of great angst. In many places, it became a source of great strength. But what it certainly did is it rediscovered for most people the sense of family, because you couldn't escape it. And while you and I have spaces where we can disappear and not wish to see any other member if we wanted, if we didn't want to, most people were thrown rumble tumble into fairly small living spaces with each other without any escape. The only escape was TikTok or the phone, or the escape that they have.
Doesn't that sound like India to you?
Oh, totally. I totally. And in fact, was my next question to you, keeping with this, Namita, is that one of the things that you seem to not have too much patience for is this slightly vapid character. So for example, Ritika, if she has a headache, you pack her off, and that's the last we ever hear of her.
No, I have a lot of sympathy for Ritika, but she hasn't come through as, you can't love as it is. You can't love every character in your novels. And I love her in the end for being a good mother and trying to be a good wife. And I do try to go into her situation as well. but she's born in a nuclear family, and she doesn't know how to negotiate these multiple spaces within this rather eccentric family, I would say. And in fact, if I may confess to you, Sanjoy, I'm worried that this novel might be a very boring read. Somebody asked me, how is it? What's it doing? Not too many people have read it or reviewed it yet. And I said, oh my God, it has a beautiful cover, but it doesn't seem to have much of a story. There's an old woman, she makes laddus, there's a family. One of the family dies, one of them. I mean, it's nothing much happens in it.
But
Really.
I think there's great drama, and we'll come to that, whether it's the cat or
Underplayed drama,
birds.
exactly.
We'll come to that in a second without being a spoiler and giving away too much. So the other thing that runs through a number of your novels is the prop. In Jaipur Diaries, you have the bag, which is in many ways a character, which contains a whole manuscript. In fact, it contains her life's work. In this, you've already referred to the barbet, and of course, there's the 5 crows, the crows, and there's, of course, Pappu. There is always a prop that runs through all your stories. And I don't know, do they appear magically, or do you write them in? Do you think them through? How do they appear?
They turn up, they just turn up. I knew there was a child going vroom, vroom with a car. I had no idea who that child was. And then he showed himself up. And the barbet, just like the thief, the burglar in the Jaipur Journals, who became the most popular character from most people who read it. That was in my previous novel. But here, the barbet was actually a bird that had been rescued by some people at home and brought in and lived in the little courtyard outside my bedroom. And it would squeak and squawk, and it made a place in our family, and we were heartbroken when it went away. And one day it just turned up in the novel, and then it wouldn't go away from my novel. So let's say that they visit me. I mean, even the handbag visited me. And I'm pretty much a handbag person, a jhola person. I seem to try to carry my life around in odds and ends wherever I go, trailing after me. And this bird similarly, but also, as I said, as I developed the bird also became an emblem of Matangi, the goddess. I was greedy for her blessings for this book. So I said, okay, here's your bird.
And what about the gilded cage? Because there's a wonderful line in the book where you refer to the bird not realizing, in a gilded cage, you don't realize you're in a cage.
Yeah, but that was just a throw-off line and a throw-off thing. But that bird exists for me. Many of us don't know about barbets the way we know about parrots, say, because they're not sort of turning up so much, but we hear their sounds in India, all around India, as a background sound,
I'm going to sort of rewind, being conscious of the time, and go back actually to Paro, which was your first book, which shook the matriarchs of India and the patriarchy of India by its sheer sexuality. And you were young, you were, I think, still in university, which you didn't complete while you were writing Paro.
Well, I was 25 when I wrote it, and I'd been thrown out of college 2 years before. I was running a film magazine, and it was published when I was 27. And I didn't know better at that time. I just wrote what amused me. And I'd say it was and is a very comical novel, and people still laugh at it when they read it. And it's a great compliment if a new generation can find my long ago jokes funny, and they look at me with a new respect and they say, you wrote this? There is a sharp and funny novel which just happened, and I'm very, very, very proud of it.
But did you realize it would be iconic for its time, and it would last through history, 5 decades of literature?
Nobody knows these things. I just wrote a novel. I typed it out, and then my husband saw me. One day he went through it and he said, oh, this reads quite well. Why don't you go to London and find an agent? Those days there were no emails. And he gifted me a ticket to go. And I was very, very lucky. I found an agent within the day, and I found 3 publishers within 2 days. And then I came back to India and faced so much anger, so much contempt. I was called a pornographist. There was a headline for not only this, but for my next novel, which said, "A promiscuous novel by an adulterous woman." That was the review who had the headline. Oh, I can't remember if it was an adulterous novel by a promiscuous woman. And I was a bit surprised. And it followed me, the notoriety of Paro, for a while. But it wasn't all that sexual. It just was rather matter of fact about things sexual. But why it survived is it had a character who came to life in Paro, the character who holds it together. And I'd like to say here that it was a record of another kind of India. And then Mihir Sharma, I think, called it almost a black box of those days of India. And then we had the India of, say, 10 years ago, which came through in the sequel to Paro, which was called Priya. And all my novels somewhere try to reflect the unsaid complexities of any understanding of this country, which I love so much, and which fascinates and perplexes me. So somewhere they are all about urban India, rural India, what I see, what I try to understand. And Paro was that sort of look, that wide-eyed look at the rich and the famous and the beautiful, before they had really entered into page 3, my look at them.
In many ways, like Paro was, preceded, like you said, the page 3 culture or the celebrity culture. In the same way, God's Graves and Grandmothers, which is how I came to your work, and we met when we adapted that wonderful piece of writing for stage and for theater. There again, in many ways, you captured what would happen 2 decades later, and what we are seeing around. And my question to you, therefore, is when you're writing, and like a lot of novelists write looking into the future without really looking into the future, what's the sense that you have when you capture these moments, which then come true, come alive, as they have both in Paro's case and, of course, in God's Graves and Grandmothers?
Well, when God's Graves and Grandmother was written, a little after that, the whole Babri Masjid thing happened, the fissures between Hindus and Muslims, which became so ugly later, were already surfacing, at least politically. But the novel is just about how, I mean, the grandmother has this thing that she is a Brahmin woman who's become a tawaif and become conveniently Muslim when it suits her identity, and gone back to her other identity as being a sort of this god woman in the thing. There is the stable figure of the priest, which I said is the religion part of it, who sincerely and honestly tries to keep to his ritual. It had a sort of a emblematic quality after it was written, but it was actually written when I was just recovering from cancer, and I was sitting at home. I couldn't go anywhere for a few months, and so I saw this old tree outside. I was living in Panchsheel at that time. There was an old banyan tree, and I used to sit in the garden or look out of the gate, and I saw over a period of about a fortnight, old tree, then 1 stone appeared, then 3 stone appeared, and before you know it, a little shrine and temple had come up. And often my novels are prescient. I did, in fact, help to build a Kumaoni temple in Delhi later, and I found the same absurdities and fights, and actually some mysterious sense of the sacred as well residing within those spaces. And so it was before its time as well.
Now, going back again to your fascination with myth and mythology, etc., Ghatotkach was such a wonderful book. And I know you began by writing it for young people, and you had Ujjaan illustrated so beautifully. But as an adult, I just loved your interpretation of this character who tends to get overlooked or doesn't have that kind of significance in the regular comic reading of the Mahabharata.
Sanjoy, I'm always drawn to the marginalized characters, the invisible heroes, the forgotten people. And Ghatotkach, when I was writing the Mahabharata for young readers, it broke my heart to think of this young man who was born of a Rakshasa, Now, that means of a different, perhaps, species of evolving human beings at that time, and of the noble Pandavas. And his mother, Hidimba, did incredible sacrifices in her love for Bhim. And she presented him with this young child, and she said, I will not cry, I will not shed one tear when you leave me. And he did leave her, as he had said he would, and they went back to their progress. And she was a single mother and pretty much the, the forgotten woman whose son was then the figure who changed the course of the battle by sacrificing his own life when it had to be done with his incredible powers. And there's a temple to Hidimba near Satta Lake in Nainital. So the story just came to me full blown. I knew I had to write the story and I didn't know why. And it didn't do all that well at that time. It didn't get much attention. I think it was because I was unable to push it. I was preoccupied with other things. Because with young people's books, you have to do a round of schools and go there and talk about it and get into that ecosystem. It's coming out again just now in Hindi, been translated by a very magnificent writer and translator. And it's coming out as an audiobook in Hindi and English, and I'm hoping to start pushing it again this time, because it's a story of time travel. It's a story of the noble Rakshasas. I mean, the Rakshas community. I'm still trying to figure out what and who they were. There were the Nagas, there were the Rakshasas. Ancient texts have many references to categories of almost human people, which we don't completely understand. And a friend was telling me the other day that maybe there were several humanoid species struggling at a certain point in history to continue. I mean, not struggling, were there, but I really, it's very futuristic. But I love Ghatotkacha. I think he is the most noble character in the Mahabharata.
The other really interesting thing is, in many of your novels and writings, you leave for the audience to make what they will of it. You don't necessarily write them out fully. The Blind Matriarch is really the first of your novels that I've seen that you've had an epilogue where you've tried to tie and have a conclusion for every character very neatly so. And I was wondering why.
The reason I did that was because the story of the pandemic was such an evolving story that it would have been incomplete to end it where I did. So I finished the novel in July last year, and then I told myself I'll go back to it and look how this whole other story evolves and try to bring the characters up to date there. And that is why I did it this time. But ambiguity is a very, very important thing to me, because I don't think any of us understand half as much as we imagine we do. And so it's not for me to impose my understanding of things to other people. It's just for me to tell a story and for other people to decrypt it, bringing their sometimes deeper understanding into it. So, for example, when you speak to me, I get so many insights into my own book from the way you have read it.
The COVID story. This is a COVID story. This is a pandemic, pretty much a pandemic story, set at the heart of the pandemic with all of the challenges that you talked about, of families living together, of eccentric neighbors, of unknown people crossing your path, of animals, of cats and birds, and the 5 crows that sat on your balcony. In all of the telling of the pandemic, what's the one truth that you found? You too were isolated for a whole period of time, a year and a half, and you can see some of that, the stillness that you had to deal with in this book. And as you said, nothing really happens, but in the nothingness of nothing happening, actually, a million things happen. A million things get sorted out. Rahul and his mother's relationship, the Surya and the relationship, with his family, and how the discovery of the adoption and who he was, and going back to the old house, etc. Many things have happened in that stillness of time.
Sanjoy, I began this novel before the pandemic. I remember it had been in my head for almost 6 months, and I'd been taking notes. But there was the previous novel, Jaipur Journals, and there was the Jaipur Lit Fest to work on. It was still a delightful physical festival. And then after that, I went to Kathmandu, and I was sitting there on the 8th of February after a conference, and I told them I'm not coming anywhere this evening. I sat down, looked out of the window, and started writing. And that's when the novel began. And then, I mean, it just went on and on, because when I came back to Delhi, there were shadows of the COVID crisis ahead of us. And then I wrote it in one go during the crisis of the pandemic as a real-time novel. So it is set in the pandemic, and so it's about the pandemic. So the things that happened when you read about, say, somebody committing suicide or Rishi Kapoor dying or something, that's what I was reading, listening to in the news. I would write in sort of 1 week periods. It's in real time. But I am not at all sure of the learnings, because the learnings of the first lockdown and the first learnings of the second lockdown were so very different. And I think so it was for the rest of the world, that what it first seemed a futuristic science fiction game almost, where we sat at home and baked bread or just wept our hearts out at the most insignificant things and said that RT-PCR jabs are so painful. The second lockdown, and we don't know what will happen in the third, completely changed our attitude to mortality. We understood that all of us could die anytime, and many of us lost dear ones. So I'd say that the learning of the first part, I don't know, but not the learning, but the recognition in the second part is of mortality, which many of us came to. Which is always there in my head, because I've always been a little bit in love with this as a novelist with death. And I must tell you that every time somebody dies, I try to figure out what happened, so that I've stored away in my head 1 billion sort of ends for my characters. Possible ends.
Of course, in the Blind Matriarch, you do it very without fuss whatsoever. Namita, you live, as I do, in many different realities at the same time. And I'm always intrigued every time you're conferred an award, as you've recently been the Yamin Hazarika Woman of Substance Award. You treat it as with a slight sense of bemusement as to, they're giving an award to me, and why me, and who is this award? And I remember you called me and you asked me who Yamin Hazarika was, and who I had known very well. You've never had a sense of, when you write, you've never had a sense that you're writing necessarily for recognition, yet recognition has been conferred upon you again and again and again.
Well, I try to sidestep that, Sanjoy, because I have so many people around me. I've witnessed them being sort of become comical and ludicrous in their self-perception. And, for writers, at least me, we don't make much money, and all we have is this little bit of worth that we pretend we know something. I've been a publisher, and I can say that the persona of a writer is not something that, I sort of like to sidestep all this fuss. And there are many prizes, awards that I actually very kindly and politely refuse, because a lot of them are a dignified way of networking by getting important people to give important prizes to unimportant people. But Yamin Hazarika, I was very, very moved by that prize, because as you well know, he was somebody who was my own age and who died young. And she would have been as old as me today. And I also had cancer when I was young. And she died when she was 43, left so much undone, but left a sense of dignity and purpose behind her. So I was very proud of that prize. But yeah, I'm not given to, I'm a backbencher, let's say.
And the last question, because I've been told we've run out of time, Namita. The cover of The Blind Matriarch is such a beautiful cover. Of course, it looks at the two characters in your book, and I wanted to speak about the crows, but maybe in another conversation, and it has the barbet. But tell us the story behind this cover, because I know there is a story.
Well, the story is that Penguin has a very brilliant art director called Elawat Gunjan. And Elawat called me, he'd read the book and he was working on the cover. And he said he'd always wanted to do an embroidered cover. And I said, go ahead, because I trust him, but I had no idea what he'd do. And he came up with this embroidered panel, which a very brilliant NID colleague of his called Lavanya Asthana actually embroidered with needle and thread. So it has a tactile feel, it has texture, and it tells the story very well. I love the cover, and I can never forget that there are many, many women around the world who tell their stories through embroidery. They have been in Greek myth, they have been in Indian history. They are whether it is the kantha work of women or the weaving of Naga shawls, which men also do, but I'm talking about textile narratives. And textile narratives are as important a part of cultural life as words, woven words. That's what I believe. And I loved this cover.
And I hope you're going to NFT the cover and at least the real version of it, and we'll get to see it framed in your home at some point of time.
I not want to give it away, but we'll see what we can do. I'll get you an embossed cover.
Namita Gokhale, thank you so much. I hope our audiences at JLF British Library London 2021 has enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. This is obviously an ongoing conversation for those of you who have heard Namita and me nattering and bantering on, because for us, it's not a conversation like most of our books that has a definitive beginning and a definitive ending. We will continue this, much more to explore. Please go and pick up at least the 5 favorite books that I would recommend, which include now The Blind Matriarch, God's Graves and Grandmothers, Paro, because you need to know the beginning, and it is a beautifully told story, Things to Leave Behind, and Ghatotkach, which is a discovery. Namita Gokhale, thank you so much.
Thank you for your very deep reading of The Blind Matriarch, and thank you as always for so many things, Sanjoy.
Thank you, and have a great day, everybody. Stay on for the next session.
Thank you, Namita. Thank you, Sanjoy, for that wonderful session. And many congratulations, Namita, on your new book. Thank you all for watching and being a lovely audience. I do hope you will stay logged on to watch our next session, to be presented shortly, A Rude Life, Veer Sanghvi in conversation with Namita Bhandare. Do stay logged on and continue to watch the exciting sessions that we have in store for you. But before that, we now present to you a short reading from the Jaipur Writer Short series. We hope you enjoy it.